Inside you lies a world you rarely dare to enter, the hidden realm where your shadow waits. You have walked through the fire of your own darkness, confronted the parts of yourself you were taught to deny, and now something feels broken. Your energy is gone. Your drive has vanished. It feels as though the very soul has abandoned you. But what if I told you this collapse is not a failure, but the secret initiation every soul must endure? What if the emptiness you feel is not the end, but the hidden doorway Carl Jung called the Nigredo, the black night of the soul, where the false self dies and the true self begins to awaken? When you begin the journey into your own unconscious, you will inevitably encounter what Carl Jung called the shadow, the hidden, repressed aspects of your psyche that you have long denied. These are not only the parts you dislike or fear, but also the elements of your being that you have buried because they did not fit the image you wanted the world to see. The shadow is the collection of forgotten impulses, unacknowledged instincts, and unlived potentials. It is everything the ego has pushed away in order to preserve a false sense of harmony. For most of your life, you may not even realize that the shadow is shaping you. It hides behind masks. Your ambition, your politeness, your perfectionism, your constant need to please or to be admired. It operates in silence, whispering in your dreams, rising in sudden anger, slipping through envy, or haunting you with irrational fears. But when the moment comes that you decide to turn inward, to truly see yourself, the shadow steps forward, and this confrontation is not gentle. It feels like looking into a mirror that reflects not the person you show to the world, but the person you secretly are when no one is watching. At first, you may resist. You might say, "This is not me. I am not capable of such darkness, such rage, such selfishness, such cruelty." But the more you resist, the stronger it becomes, because the shadow thrives on denial. It feeds on repression. The act of pushing it away only strengthens its grip. Jung wrote that, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And so, when you truly begin shadow work, you are not playing with abstract ideas. You are staring into the abyss of your own humanity. This is why the confrontation with the shadow can be so exhausting. It is not merely an intellectual exercise, it is an emotional and spiritual upheaval. You begin to recognize the masks you wear, and with each mask that falls, you lose a piece of the energy that once held your identity together. The charming persona you carefully constructed begins to crumble. The false motivations that kept you striving, the hunger to be loved, the fear of being rejected, the desire to be powerful or admired, suddenly reveal themselves as illusions. And when these illusions fall, you feel stripped bare, exposed to the raw truth of your own nature. The shadow does not only show you your darkness, it also reveals the cost of your avoidance. Every time you rejected an impulse, denied a truth, or silenced a need, you pushed energy into the unconscious. That energy does not disappear, it accumulates. It waits for you in the shadows, heavy and unresolved. And when you finally confront it, all of that repressed force comes rushing back into your awareness. It overwhelms you. It shakes your sense of who you are. It drains the energy you once borrowed from denial, because the game of pretending is over. Imagine carrying a secret for years, holding it tightly so no one can see. At first, it feels manageable, even invisible. But over time, the weight grows heavier, the burden greater. And then one day, you cannot hold it anymore. The secret bursts forth, and though you may feel a strange relief, you are also left weak, trembling, emptied out. That is the nature of the shadow's unveiling. You may notice it in the way your dreams turn darker, filled with symbols you do not understand, but feel compelled to explore. You may notice it in sudden emotional floods, an anger that erupts without reason, a sadness that seems to come from nowhere, a deep fatigue that rests in your bones. These are signs that the shadow is no longer content to remain buried. It is demanding to be seen, to be integrated. And here lies the paradox: the shadow is not only your enemy, it is also your teacher. Hidden in its darkness are the very qualities you need for wholeness. The aggressiveness you repressed may be the courage you require to stand firm. The envy you denied may point to the unlived life you secretly desire. The selfishness you condemned may be the healthy self-love you have been missing. But in order to discover these treasures, you must first walk through the terror of exposure. Facing the shadow strips away the illusions you have clung to for survival. It shows you the falseness of borrowed identities. It reveals that much of your motivation was built not on authentic desire, but on fear, shame, and the desperate attempt to hide what you did not want others to see. When this truth breaks open, the old sources of energy fall silent. You no longer feel the same fire to chase external goals, because the unconscious has shown you that these pursuits were built on fragile foundations. This is why so many feel an emptiness after confronting their shadow. It is not because they are broken. It is because the old fuel has burned out. The ego can no longer pretend. The persona can no longer sustain its mask. The fire that once drove you was never truly yours. It was borrowed from repression. And when repression ends, that fire dies out. The confrontation with the shadow is, therefore, not just about seeing darkness. It is about losing the very illusions that gave you strength. It is about stepping into a void where your old self cannot survive. This void is frightening because it feels like the death of everything you once knew. And in a way it is. But it is also the beginning of something far deeper. Something that waits beneath the ashes of the persona you once called me. When the shadow rises and your illusions fall away, something strange begins to happen inside you. The old fuel that once kept you moving, striving, and chasing suddenly vanishes. You wake up in the morning and feel the emptiness where your ambition used to burn. You look at the goals that once consumed you, and they no longer carry the same fire. The drive that once felt so natural begins to collapse, and you are left with a deep question pressing against your chest. Why do I no longer care about the things I thought mattered most? This collapse is not accidental. It is the direct consequence of seeing through the masks you once believed in. Much of your motivation throughout life has not been authentic. It has been constructed. Built from fear, shaped by childhood wounds, reinforced by cultural demands, and animated by the desperate need to be accepted, admired, or safe. When you were young, you learned what was rewarded and what was punished. You built a persona around those lessons, crafting an identity that could survive in the world. And with that identity came certain motivations. You pushed yourself to succeed, not always because success mattered, but because failure meant shame. You sought love, not always out of genuine connection, but because rejection felt like annihilation. You worked tirelessly, not because your soul longed for it, but because idleness was condemned. These motives are not false in the sense of being unreal. They are false in the sense of being borrowed. They are not born from the deepest truth of your being. They are stitched together from fear, survival, and the expectations of others. And when you confront your shadow, you begin to see this clearly. The veil lifts. You realize that so much of what drove you was never truly yours. It was the voice of the ego desperately trying to prove itself. It was the echo of old wounds screaming not to be abandoned again. When this realization dawns, the collapse feels like a death, because in a way it is. The very fire that pushed you forward begins to extinguish itself, and at first it feels terrifying. Without those external motivations, who are you? Without the constant chase, what remains of your identity? The collapse of false motivation feels like standing in a vast and empty desert, stripped of every landmark that once gave your life direction. Jung understood this collapse as part of the individuation process, the slow breaking down of the ego's illusions so that something deeper can emerge. But the ego does not go quietly. It fights for survival. It whispers that without these goals, you are nothing. It tries to reignite the old flames, urging you to care again about the same validations, the same competitions, the same empty pursuits. Yet, once the shadow has been faced, once you have tasted the truth, those flames cannot burn as they once did. You may try to force yourself back into your old motivations, but the energy will not be there. It will feel hollow, mechanical, lifeless. This is why people often speak of a deep exhaustion after shadow work. It is not merely physical. It is existential. You are no longer being propelled by unconscious fears, and without them, your psyche falls into stillness. What you are experiencing is the breakdown of borrowed desires, the collapse of the scaffolding that held up the false self. And though it feels unbearable, this stage is necessary. For as long as your life is fueled by fear and illusion, you remain a prisoner of the ego's performance. Notice how much of your old motivation was tied to the gaze of others, how much you wanted to be seen as strong, competent, admirable, how much you feared being exposed as weak, flawed, or unworthy. The shadow strips this away. It shows you that behind the mask of confidence was insecurity. Behind the drive for success was the fear of failure. Behind the need to help others was the fear of being abandoned. Once you see these hidden truths, you cannot unsee them, and the very energy they once produced dissolves in your hands. The collapse of false motivation is also a confrontation with emptiness. You stand before a void, and the void stares back. There is no easy escape, no quick return to the old ways. The unconscious demands patience. It demands that you endure this silence without rushing to fill it. This is where many falter, because the ego cannot tolerate emptiness. It wants noise, movement, direction. But the psyche, in its wisdom, knows that this collapse is sacred. It is the purging of what is false, so that what is true may eventually rise. Think of it like a mask being peeled away. At first, the mask was all you knew, and you mistook it for your face. It gave you purpose, but it was not you. When the mask is finally removed, you feel naked, vulnerable, unprotected, and in that nakedness, there is no motivation to perform, no energy to keep up the act. You feel drained, not because life has abandoned you, but because you are no longer feeding on illusions. This stage is often misunderstood as depression, laziness, or failure. But in Jungian psychology, it is something much deeper. It is the psyche dismantling the false engines of your being. It is the fire of transformation consuming what no longer serves your soul. It is the necessary silence before a new voice can speak. As the false motivation collapses, you begin to see the fragility of the old system. You see how much of your life was sustained by fear of rejection, by shame of inadequacy, by longing to be seen. And though the emptiness feels unbearable, it is precisely here that the unconscious prepares you for something new. Not yet the authentic flame, not yet the true drive, but the space in which they may someday be born. When the illusions of the ego collapse and the false fires of motivation burn out, you enter a stage that ancient alchemists described as the nigredo, the blackening. Jung recognized this as more than metaphor. It is the psychological death phase, the moment when the old self dissolves and the psyche is cast into darkness. This stage is not glamorous. It does not sparkle with immediate insights or quick rebirth. It feels heavy, silent, and endless. You walk through a night of the soul, in which your former identity lies in ruins, and all that remains is a void that swallows every attempt to escape. The death phase begins subtly. At first, you may notice the fading of desire. The pursuits that once gave your days meaning seem hollow. The projects, the goals, the relationships you once clung to for identity feel strangely lifeless. You may even wonder if something is wrong with you, as though your very soul has gone numb. But this numbness is not accidental. It is the psyche withdrawing its energy from the structures of the false self. It is the soul refusing to feed what can no longer sustain you. To the ego, this is terrifying. The ego thrives on control, on action, on certainty. It wants to know what is next, where you are headed, what you must do. And in this phase, None of those answers are given. The death phase strips away direction, leaving you suspended in the unknown. You may wake in the morning and feel no urge to rise. You may sit among the familiar patterns of your life and feel like a ghost in your own world. The things you once cared about slip from your hands like sand, and you are left with an overwhelming silence. Jung saw this silence as essential, for transformation cannot occur while the old identity still holds power. The ego must die, at least symbolically, for the deeper self to emerge. This death is not a single moment. It is a process. A slow unraveling of attachments, a disintegration of the masks you wore, a surrender of the illusions you once worshipped. And with each unraveling, the sense of emptiness grows. This is why the death phase is often accompanied by despair. You may believe that you have lost yourself, that life has no meaning, that the spark within you has been extinguished. And in a way, all of that is true. The self you thought you were has died. The persona that was held together by fear and desire no longer exists. But what the ego calls death, the unconscious calls preparation. The alchemists described the nigredo as the stage where matter decays, where all structures rot and dissolve, where darkness consumes form. They knew that only through this decay could something new be born. Jung recognized the same principle in the psyche. When the death phase takes hold, it feels as though everything you once were is decomposing. Your ambitions, your certainties, even your sense of identity begin to break down. And in this breaking down, the ground of the soul is being made fertile for something deeper. Yet this process cannot be rushed. The modern mind, obsessed with quick fixes and instant transformation, rebels against the patience required here. You may want to skip ahead, to leap straight into renewal, to claim the light before enduring the darkness. But the psyche does not bend to willpower. The death phase demands surrender. It demands that you sit in the silence, that you endure the loss, that you let yourself be emptied. It is in this emptiness that the most profound changes occur. When everything external loses its meaning, you are forced to turn inward. You are confronted with the raw ground of your being, stripped of roles, stripped of pretenses, stripped of borrowed desires. And though it feels unbearable, this confrontation is the threshold of transformation. For only when the old self has died can the new self begin to take shape. Dreams during this phase often reflect death, decay, or darkness. Images of funerals, of collapsing structures, of barren landscapes may arise in the unconscious. These are not signs of doom, but symbols of the process unfolding. The psyche communicates through images, and in these dark visions, it reveals that the old order is dissolving. The unconscious is showing you what the ego resists, that the structures of your former life must crumble so that new foundations may be laid. The death phase is not only an inner process, it also spills into outer life. Relationships may dissolve, careers may lose their grip, habits, passions, and attachments may fall away. This can feel like devastation, as though life itself is collapsing around you. But each collapse is a mirror of the inner transformation. The world outside shifts to reflect the world within. The soul is orchestrating a death on every level, preparing for a rebirth that cannot yet be seen. And still, the waiting continues. For the death phase has no clear timeline. It does not follow the clock of the ego. Days may feel like years, and years may feel like an eternity. The silence stretches on, and you wonder if it will ever end. But beneath the surface, something is stirring. Just as the soil must lie fallow before new seeds can take root, the psyche must rest in this barren stage before authentic life can emerge. In mythology, this phase is mirrored in countless stories. The hero who descends into the underworld, the god who is torn apart before being reborn, the night before the dawn, the winter before the spring. These archetypal images exist because the death phase is universal. Every soul that seeks wholeness must endure it. Every seeker who faces the shadow must walk through it. It is not punishment, it is initiation. When you feel this heaviness, when all motivation has left you, when the silence swallows you whole, remember that you are walking the path of countless souls before you. You are undergoing the symbolic death that prepares the way for something greater. And though the ego screams in terror, the unconscious knows that only through this dissolution can the deeper self begin to awaken. Out of the darkness of the death phase, something begins to stir, quietly, almost imperceptibly. After the collapse of false motivation and the stripping away of illusions, the psyche does not leave you in endless emptiness. It begins to form something new, something different, something that carries a weight unlike the fleeting ambitions of the ego. This is the stage of rebirth, where authentic energy begins to rise, not from fear or longing for approval, but from the deep center of the self. At first, this energy is subtle. It does not roar like the flames of ego-driven ambition. It flickers like a candle in a room that has long been dark. You may feel it as a faint sense of curiosity, a quiet pull toward something that has no clear shape. It does not demand, it does not shout, it simply whispers. And yet this whisper holds more truth than the loudest voice of the persona. Because this time, the energy does not come from outside validation. It comes from within. Jung described this as the moment when the self, the organizing principle of the psyche, begins to assert itself. For so long the ego was in control, clinging to its masks, feeding on false motivations, trying to maintain an identity built on fear and expectation. But once the shadow is faced, once the death phase dissolves the old order, the ego is no longer the only voice. The self emerges as the new center, carrying with it a deeper, more authentic source of power. This rebirth is not dramatic. It does not arrive with trumpets or sudden explosions of clarity. Instead, it moves like dawn breaking after the longest night. Slowly, the light creeps across the horizon. Slowly, the colors of life return. You begin to notice a shift within yourself, a sense of aliveness that is not tied to external success, not bound to the judgments of others. You begin to feel drawn to things that nourish your soul rather than feed your ego. The authentic energy of the self is different from the restless drive of the ego. Ego-driven energy is frantic, always chasing, always needing more. It is fueled by the fear of being nothing, of being unseen, of being unloved. Authentic energy, however, is steady. It does not panic, it does not scramble. It flows from a deeper place, a source that does not exhaust itself. When you act from this energy, you feel aligned, as though your actions are not forced but natural. As though life is moving through you, rather than you struggling to push against it. This is why Jung spoke of individuation as the path to wholeness. It is not about becoming perfect, nor about ascending above human flaws. It is about aligning your outer life with the truth of your inner being. It is about letting the self, rather than the ego, guide your choices. And when that alignment occurs, the energy you experience is entirely different. It is not borrowed, it is not fragile, it is your own. Many people fear this stage because they expect rebirth to look like triumph. They imagine rising from the ashes in glory, with passion and certainty blazing. But the reality of authentic energy is quieter, humbler. It does not seek to impress. It does not need recognition. It is not concerned with appearances. Instead, it is rooted in truth. And truth, once embraced, brings with it a kind of peace that no external achievement can match. You may notice, for example, that your ambitions shift. What once felt urgent no longer matters, and what once seemed trivial now calls to you with great importance. You may be drawn to creativity, not for fame, but for expression. You may be drawn to service, not for recognition, but for love. You may find yourself seeking simplicity, nature, silence, things the ego once dismissed as unproductive. This is the mark of authentic energy. It guides you toward what is real, not what is rewarded. The rebirth of authentic energy is also deeply archetypal. Myths across the world tell of gods and heroes who descend into darkness, die to their old selves, and return transformed. Osiris torn apart and resurrected, Christ descending into death and rising anew. Persephone returning from the underworld each spring. These stories mirror the process of the psyche, showing us that every death is followed by a rebirth. And this rebirth always carries a new kind of power, not the power of conquest, but the power of truth. This energy is also sustainable in a way that ego energy never was. When you were driven by fear or desire, your energy rose and fell with circumstances. Success brought a temporary high, failure brought despair, and you were forever caught in the cycle. But authentic energy does not fluctuate with external conditions. It flows from the self, which is timeless, unshaken by the shifting tides of the world. When you act from this place, you no longer burn out in the same way. You no longer collapse from exhaustion, because you are not forcing yourself against your own nature. You are moving with it. It is important to recognize, though, that this stage does not erase struggle. The ego does not vanish, the shadow does not disappear. They remain part of the psyche, forever present. But their role shifts. The ego is no longer the ruler. It becomes a servant. The shadow is no longer the enemy. It becomes an ally, and the self at last begins to guide. With this new order, the energy you carry feels authentic, balanced, and deeply alive. The rebirth of authentic energy is not the end of the journey. It is a beginning. A return to life, but not the same life as before. It is a return to your own essence, the place you had long forgotten beneath the weight of masks and illusions. It is the moment when you realize that true motivation was never about proving yourself to the world, but about embodying the truth of who you are. And from that truth flows a strength that cannot be taken away, a flame that no darkness can extinguish. As we stand at the threshold of this journey, it becomes clear that the path through the shadow is not a detour. It is the very road to your soul. Every collapse, every moment of emptiness, every death of false motivation is not a punishment, but a sacred invitation. The darkness you feared was never meant to consume you. It was meant to strip away everything that was borrowed, everything that was false, so that the true flame of your being could rise. The emptiness you have felt, the silence that seemed unbearable, the loss of energy and drive, these are not signs of failure. They are the echoes of transformation, the clearing of space within your psyche for a deeper, more authentic life to emerge. And though the journey is arduous, though the night feels endless, the soul moves toward wholeness. The shadow does not destroy, it refines. The collapse does not break, it clears. The death phase does not end, it prepares. What rises from this process is not merely motivation, but a profound alignment with the self, a flame that is no longer borrowed, no longer conditional, no longer subject to the whims of fear or approval. It is your energy, your truth, your life, flowing with the quiet power of authenticity. And as you move forward, carrying this light, you may finally understand that the darkness you feared was never an enemy, but the very crucible that forged your deepest strength. The question now lingers in the silence. When all illusions fall away, when all borrowed fires extinguish, when the soul stands naked before itself, will you have the courage to embrace the quiet flame that emerges from the ashes and let it guide you into the life you were always meant to live?